Okay, two things that are going on in the government that are like top priorities right now. One is the CDC, which of course is the organization that's handling the vaccine and tracking the progress of COVID. And the other one, which probably is equally as important, is the Federal Reserve. And the Federal Reserve chairman is Jerome Powell. Jot that down somewhere because that's going to be a test question. And yesterday, Jerome Powell came on and talked about what the Federal Reserve is going to do with interest rates, because the Federal Reserve decides where interest rates are going to be. The Federal Reserve has this overnight rate, and that's basically what they charge banks. And then the banks turn around and they lend money to people for like buying a mortgage and things like that. And many of you checked in and you said mortgage rates are at around 3.5%, which is correct. And that the 10-year Treasury, depending on what day you told me, was between 0.6% and 0.9%, which is pretty big fluctuation in the Treasury market. But basically that means that the government is paying you, let's just say it's 0.6%, 0.6% to borrow money from them for 10 years. So that's 0.6% per year that they're paying to borrow money from you. So like if you lent them $100,000, they would pay you $600 a year for lending them the money, which is actually pretty decent compared to some of these bigger governments around the world. Like for instance, in Germany, they actually pay you a negative rate. And so you lend them $100,000, they give you $999,000 back. They give you $99,000 back after 10 years, and they don't give you any interest. At least right now, the United States government is giving some sort of interest, and so that's certainly important. So the Federal Reserve lends banks money, and then they use that to turn around and lend it to other people for buying houses or mortgage, or for building new buildings, or maybe opening up a business and things like that. And like I said, you can see here the fund rate, which is 0 to 0.25%. So the Federal Reserve lends money very cheap right now to banks. Sometimes you'll also hear it as the LIBOR rate, London Interbank overnight rate. But anyway, it doesn't really matter. The thing is that the Federal Reserve lends money, and then they also control the money supply, which one thing that's kind of interesting as far as the money supply, there's 80% more money in the supply right now than there was in February, and that's from all the stimulus that the Federal Reserve's doing and the federal government's doing. So one thing that I wanted to talk about was how the Federal Reserve is working these things to try to keep the market afloat and try to make sure that the economy keeps moving. And so on March 16th, if the Federal Reserve had not stepped in to bail out the bond market, especially like the municipal bond market and the money market rate, then probably the economy would have collapsed. But the Federal Reserve fortunately did step in and basically said, don't worry, we're not going to let any of these bonds go bankrupt. We're going to make sure that they stay solvent, and we'll buy them if we have to. And so they were basically keeping the bond market going, which is awesome because we really need the bond market to keep going. But in any case, they basically stepped in and did that. And since then, they've been pumping all this extra money into the system. And by pumping extra money into the system, one thing that it's doing is giving people more money to buy stocks. And then since bonds are so low, the interest rate on bonds are so low, people aren't buying bonds, so they're buying stocks instead. And then the other thing that the Federal Reserve is doing, and this goes back to this program called quantitative easing, and you may have even heard it referred to as QE. In quantitative easing, the Federal Reserve goes out and buys mortgages, and so a bank will have like a big package of mortgages that they'll buy, and they even buy Federal Reserve or federal bonds, so those 10-year bonds that are referred to, or those 30-year bonds. The Federal Reserve will go out and buy those. And by the way, to buy those, they just create the money. They don't have to like get it from tax money or anything like that. They're able to print money any way that they want to. And so they print the money and then they go out and buy these bonds, which normally you would expect it's going to create inflation, and you would have thought that in the last 10 years because they've been doing this quantitative easing for many years now. But so far it hasn't. We'll see how it goes, because it looks like there's probably going to be about $7 trillion in more money added to the system from what the federal government's doing as far as assistance and what the Federal Reserve's doing. So the thing that I wanted to focus on and just make sure that everybody's aware of is, again, CDC is so important because they're the ones tracking COVID and making sure that we know about social distancing and that we know what's going on with new cases and vaccines. But then equally important, and certainly on the economic side, it's the Federal Reserve that's keeping things going in the economy. And so when you hear about Jerome Powell speaking, think that's something that's really important, and I got to listen to what's going on with that. I got to see what's happening with interest rates. If inflation starts to rise, they can't keep interest rates this low. They'll have to start increasing interest rates. When that happens, are people going to still borrow money to buy a new house? Are they going to borrow money to buy a car or open up a business? And so those are issues that you have to be concerned with. We'll do a lot more of this when we get to monetary policy, but since Jerome Powell was speaking yesterday, I thought it's important that we cover this. And I will have a couple of questions on our exam about it. Maybe what's the 10-year Treasury bond at? Or is it at 8%, which of course it's not. And maybe what they are lending money to banks, what the rate that they're charging banks, which basically is free, right? They're just basically giving them money and letting them spend it because there's hardly any interest. And of course, since the banks don't have to pay any interest, then they don't have to increase the interest rates on mortgages. So keep that in mind. And then actually, I'm about to do another video, but that's going to be embedded into the modules. That's going to be on Social Security. And so I'll check in with you on that later.